Hello and welcome. So I'm going to be doing the introduction tonight because Ella's out of town. So she'll be back next week and all will be well. So one of the things I want to continue on is some of the subjects we were speaking about last week on the 4th of July. I hope everybody had a good 4th of July. So anyways, the whistleblower that I just heard about, who is Dr. Gal Luff, is from Israel. He's an Israeli professor. And apparently he was on a board over in China with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden being present. And he had all kinds of whistleblower information that he was going to release. And this has been all over the news. And apparently he was in some meeting, I think it was in Cyprus, or I forget what exactly, he was arrested in Cyprus. And essentially what's been happening is he had all this information that was going to expose the millions, and I do mean lots of millions here, being paid to the Biden administration, and I'm sure others behind the scenes. And that's probably why he was arrested just recently. And he basically is on the run for his life. He's basically going to be a whistleblower on the run. And he's very afraid of getting killed. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happens. That's been happening to several people. Of course, if we look back, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of people seem to end up having Jack Ruby flu or getting JFK haircuts or other horrible things done to them when they're in the wrong path of the wrong people. So this is a very interesting thing. And I bring this up because remember what I was saying, the United States is going through three aspects of Neptune opposing Neptune. And we also just finished the Neptune square Mars. And what does all this mean in plain English? Well, subterfuge. If there's ever been a time that we have had smoke being blown up our rear ends, it is definitely now. Not that that doesn't happen most of the time with government and so on and so forth, but I would say now more than ever. And clearly there's like 5 whistleblowers who've come forward. This is from the IRS. This is another guy, again, this Israeli professor from Israel and was over in China. And clearly the evidence is overwhelming. This president is not compromised. He's treasonous. And I think Benedict Arnold was probably more faithful to the United States than Biden is. And they're doing everything they can to hide it. And this isn't just Biden. Obviously, Biden can't find his way across the room without being told which way to go or even led. And I'm not even sure it's him most of the time. There's been rumors that he just died. I don't know that I buy that one. I didn't really look too deeply into it. But one thing's for sure, he's really senile and he's really compromised. So, and of course, we got the cocaine issue that just happened here. And of course, everyone's wondering where that came from. And clearly, our government is a 3-ring circus right now with Biden not even able to direct anything. So that's some interesting stuff. And everything keeps pointing back to China and Ukraine. It's just nonstop. And I have said that Biden's inauguration chart, Harrison Biden's inauguration chart, really looks rough. I'm going to be really surprised if this administration goes the distance. And I think the walls are closing in. And I'm a little bit disappointed, which I'm sure everyone else is too, at the slow pace at which everyone has to proceduralize everything. I mean, I think the French had the right idea. Just get the guillotines, It's treason. And clearly, it is insane right now. What we're witnessing, I've never seen anything like this in my life. I've never heard of anything like this other than maybe back, some of the history, like in the War of 1812 and 1820, and some of the other things that we've seen going on. Even Watergate isn't this insane. So crazy stuff. And it's mirroring the astrology. And I really think, again, I've said this last podcast, and I've said it several podcasts, the United States has progressions that are going on and transits. The Pluto return, that's the nation destroyer. Literally, Pluto is when nations rise and fall, when you have Pluto returns. And it's been demonstrated by other past look-sees, like in the Roman Empire, certainly one good example. And it literally was destroyed on the final Pluto return that it had. It actually survived 2 of them. The first one, it broke up and lost a lot of its power, which is kind of where the United States seems to be right now if it's not saved. So we're in dire times here, folks, and I really hope I'm wrong about this. But, we listen to all the podcasts and all the information coming through, and it is clearly mirroring what the astrology says. We are in a time of great change where the owners at the top of the pyramid are really shuffling the deck. So that's a little bit of an update on that. And as we get into fall, I'll certainly be getting into that a lot more with Ella with us. So the topic tonight that I wanted to get into is something really fun that I was exposed to back in the 70s. My mother was a specialist in hemodialysis, and it was a lot of fun to converse with her, not only about astrology, but also about her opinions on medicine. She started out as an RN, actually an LPN, then she went to an RN, and then she ended up being, I don't know if she was actually a nurse practitioner at the end, because she got cancer and she was very sick, but she was heading in that direction if she wasn't, and I can't remember all the details. But you'll see the pictures here where she was actually treating patients, and she was an animal lover too. You can see we used to catch little pet deer and bring them in and raise them, because the mothers would get hit by cars, and the coyotes would get them. So I'd drag them home, me and my brothers would, and we would raise them from bottles. And we've actually got pictures of the deer in the house eating cookies out of her hand. So pretty wild stuff. So anyways, what the topic is tonight is about medical astrology. And this is something I've really been wanting to get into, because we certainly can't get into all the details here tonight, but I want to give a broad overview of some of the historical issues that are profound about Ayurvedic astrology, medieval astrology, and this goes all the way back to antiquity. As far back as documents allow us to go, there seems to be an observance of using astrology for healing purposes. And of course, that was parallel with herbs. And some of the more later astrologers that I'll put on the screen here, clearly everyone's heard of William Lilly. There was also Joe Partridge. There was Joseph Blagrave. So there was many, many different astrologers here. And of course, many from India too, I might add. India and the Far East was full of different practices with herbs, using astrology and timing, not only to administer the herbs, but also to diagnose through something that they would call a decumbiture. Now, that's kind of a more medieval term, but decumbiture just means at the time that someone falls ill or a physician was called in the old world. And what they would do is literally cast a chart. And of course, back then, the astrologers would use urine. They would examine the color of the urine. And also, they would also check many different things, body temperature, et cetera. And a lot of people think it was just archaic and bloodletting. They just think everyone was cutting their wrists and letting blood. Not that they didn't do that, but I would also say it was very sophisticated. And as we go farther back from the 16, 15, 14, and 1300s, we start really getting into even more depth. And one of my favorite astrologers is Rabbi Ibn Ezra. Ezra put out a prolific volume of work, not only in medical astrology, but also electional astrology, interrogation astrology, and also natal astrology. And he would be brought around by different kings as a court astrologer to do various different elections for the royalty and also very wealthy persons. So, and I can't tell you how much accuracy I have seen in this. Now, I want to be careful here because, I do have great respect for science and allopathic medicine. Allopathic medicine, obviously, is what we go to our doctor for, your normal MD. And allopathy is fine because it has good science. I respect, especially in trauma, what they can do to heal people or save people's lives. And I mean, you get a paramedic arriving on the scene that saves you in a car accident, or you have a much better chance of living, I'll say that. So there's a lot of great things about modern medicine. One of the biggest complaints that I hear is that modern medicine is really good at diagnosing symptoms, but it's not so good at finding causes. Now, with that being said, I know a lot of great doctors, and some of them are very good friends of mine, who are just geniuses at blood work, at blood platelet work, all this different stuff. But the ones who've been in it a long time and the ones who really become naturopaths really enjoy the vibration of natural herbs and also reflexology, Reiki, and other healing modalities. And there's many of them. Acupuncture is wonderful. Again, I have mentioned in past podcasts my respect and also my own personal experiences with reflexology. I can't say enough about it. And I've talked about the reflex roller. I'll put that on the screen. I've also talked about the massage guns that are out there. But the key to it is understanding where these meridian points are and associating that when you hold a diagram and you put your feet, or you start working your hands, and you associate that if you have blockage there. Sometimes it's a bit painful, but what's so great is once you break up those blockages, and many believe it's some kind of a calcified or crystalline globulation, whatever it actually is, I don't know. But I've literally felt it, where there's just masses that surround these meridian points. And when you break them up, you can feel them with your finger. But if you're using like a machine, like the reflex roller, you'll actually feel it in your feet. It almost kind of hurts. And there's a secret to this. When you break it up, you take your hand like you're going to shake someone's hand and you put it under your armpit. And actually, this is hieroglyph paintings on the Egyptian pyramid walls. I've actually seen that. Manly P. Hall had pictures of that, where the pharaoh was getting, or the queen was getting their feet worked on with reflexology. And in order to mitigate the pain, you just put your hand underneath that armpit. And I got to tell you, I've been doing that for probably 25, 30 years. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I have healed up carpal tunnel in my own self. I have really eliminated stuff with my lymph. Again, back pain, hip pain, kidneys. And I always tell the story about my 80, or I should say my 75-year-old grandmother in 1982. She was really told to have her kidneys out by the doctor. And I said, well, if you want to try something first, I said, why don't you give reflexology a try? And I got her on that with hydrangea root, gravel root, marshmallow root, and goldenrod tea. And she died at 102 years old with 2 functioning kidneys. Never had any problems ever since. And again, I'm not saying you shouldn't go to your doctor. Doctors are really good at analysis. They really are. And they have so many wonderful tools in the blood test. But it's your choice how we approach mitigating it or getting rid of what the problem is. And I'm not saying I'm not in a war against pharmaceutical companies, because a lot of times I've seen pharmaceuticals save people's lives, particularly in heart medications and many other things. They're really good at arresting, chronic, or I should say acute things. But often people complain where, they stay on the medications, they get side effects, and then they start taking other medications to counteract that side effect. And it becomes a snowball effect. So, you got to be careful. And one thing I have to tell you in this podcast, do not combine herbs with pharmaceuticals. You have to talk to a doctor about that, or a pharmacist, or both, preferably. I always tell people, don't start combining herbs, Chinese herbs or regular herbs. If you're on medications, you really need to find a naturopathic doctor to make sure that whatever you would want to do with herbs or any other type of naturopathic treatment, that you don't cause trouble, because it can actually kill you. I know a sad story. A very dear friend of mine and client passed away because went into an emergency room and a doctor didn't check that she was on one medication and administered another. It killed her. So this is stuff that is really dangerous if you're on meds. And I always say it's really good to find a naturopathic doctor anyhow, who's an MD, that can parallel and actually do the blood tests and the checking. Like, for instance, I had a long time ago, very dear friend, he was in his 80s and he had a stroke. And many people will find as you get older, your organs and your glands just aren't as strong as they were. And that's where reflexology and things like that can fortify you, even if you're on medications, because reflexology does not mess with medications. It may actually improve them. But anyhow, he had a stroke and he got on Coumadin and got very, very sick. And he started taking turmeric, but he got off the Coumadin and kept seeing the doctor. And what was wonderful about that was the doctor said, "Oh my God, your cholesterol levels are really in line now." This was like 6 months later. And he said, "That Coumadin's really working." He says, "I haven't touched the Coumadin now for close to 4.5, 5 months." He says, "I stopped taking it and now I'm on turmeric." And the doctor was, kind of taken aback. He said, "Well, it must be the Coumadin." And he said, "No, I think it's the turmeric." So these things can work, but I really caution you, don't just throw doctors in the wind, because some of them are really, really good. If you find the right one, they're worth their weight in gold, and their ability to test you is worth a lot. And especially if you're playing around with herbs and alternative treatments, it's a good thing. It's like changing oil in the car. It's nice to get a blood test and know that, hey, everything is right on. Like one of the things I wanted to get into tonight is, what does astrology contribute to this? Well, I can tell you this. I've had many instances throughout my life where I've had a lot of health issues. In the 60s, I think it was in the mid 60s or thereabouts, I got vaccinated and I literally passed out. I almost broke my neck. The whole side of my face was scraped up. And ever since then, I've had a compromised immune system, really wiped out, really tired. And I've always been seeking ways to track my energy levels. And I have found in medical astrology, many of these ancient astrologers were right on. They looked at 3 major categories: transits, progressions, and primary directions. And if you're into the Vedic astrology, which I am, the Nadi progressions combined with the doshas are absolutely stunning. And one guy I want to mention here who deserves a lot of good credit is Dr. V.B. Rahman. I'll put him on the screen. And also a more modern practitioner, which was Dr. David Frowley. Wonderful stuff. He has put out some elegant books on Ayurvedic astrology as well, if anybody's interested in pursuing that stuff. And, Chakrapani was a friend of mine. He's probably the man who coined the name Vedic astrology in the 60s. And these people were really raised in a culture in India that appreciated the energetics that astrology showed. And, a lot of people have said, oh, astrology is not a science. It actually is, when you analyze it the proper way. It is all just geometry, aspects, and timing. And a perfect example, about 4 years ago, about 3.5 years ago, I had some really bad outbreaks with skin and redness and rashes. And of course, I had Ketu, the moon's south node, going over my Saturn. And this is something I always tell people when I see Ketu going over Saturn. I can't give medical diagnosis, but I always tell them, this is a great time to check your health. Go see the doctor, get some blood tests, know where you're at, and be very careful of your diet. Because Ketu over Saturn, well, Jupiter is also hitting Rahu, can take us out of this world. Now, if you're strong and you're healthy and you're young, it may not. It takes very special combinations, but I have invariably seen my mother, who I had on the screen before, died at 47 years old from cancer. It was really sad. And they just didn't catch it in time. And she actually lasted close to a decade using alternative methods. And Mayo Clinic pronounced her dead within 3 weeks. And she lived almost a decade on alternative treatments. And then later, the alternative treatments got stopped. We won't get into that story, but the doctors got shut down. And it came back severely. I also wanted to mention there's something very important called remedial measures in Vedic astrology. And you can actually do it in the Western astrology as well. And that is gemology. In the Far East, or you could say in Vedic astrology, they call it Vedic Planetary Gemology. And it's a whole science of prescribing the proper gems that are correct for you. You can actually see I make talismans that are not just jewelry, but it's actually a talismanic piece that's set to your birth chart. And you can actually see some of these have your guardian angel on that. And that's derived from the inner 7 planets And you add Aleph Lamed to the end of it, which means L. All angels end in L. So this is really profound stuff. And I can't say enough about the feedback I've gotten on it, including my own energies on it. I've actually worked with a doctor over at, I won't mention where, but he was from India, and his father was in his 80s, and he was very sick. He was in ICU, and he said, Jeff, what types of gems would you prescribe for my father? And I looked at his birth chart using Vedic astrology, and I said, well, you want this particular gem and this particular gem. It was a yellow sapphire and also a chrysoberyl cat's eye, and which strengthens Jupiter for the yellow sapphire, and the chrysoberyl strengthens Ketu. And here's what's interesting. We put the gems on him in an ICU with a lot of technical equipment. He was finding the breathing got more sustained and deeper diaphragmically, and the heart rates became more regular. So this is something I prescribe for a lot of people is gemstones. And I actually don't make jewelry. I make talismans. And we're going to go into this a lot more with Ella down the line here. But essentially, Vedic planetary gemology can really fortify the auric field. And it's been known for thousands of years. Hence why we have seen kings and queens and pharaohs and people throughout history wear gemstones, particularly in the crown area where the third eye chakra is. And I can tell you my own experience wearing gemstones, it has really made a huge difference, an absolutely huge difference. I can feel it. I've taken them off. I've double checked it. I've had thousands of clients wear the proper gemstones, and they've all said, you know, I can really feel the difference, especially when they're set at a proper time to your birth chart, and then they're charged. So we'll go into this later on another more detailed podcast, but very fascinating stuff. Also, gem elixirs can be used, where literally the cuttings from the gem are put into a liquid and they're drank. Another thing that's really interesting about Vedic astrology is remedial measures in general, which encompasses not only gemstones, gem elixirs, but also certain mantras. There are prayers that people will make, not to idolatry to planets, but to the divinity of the planets or the archangels ruling the planets. And this is a whole topic that gets into yoga and tantra and remedial measures, which is very, very fascinating. But what's interesting about this whole subject of medical astrology, you can see by your transits and progressions and directions and dashas, all your timing methods, when the rough waters are more likely to come in. And I really believe we can alter the severity and quite possibly even eliminate it if we're on top of it. If we pay attention to things like parasites, cleansing, you know, again, Ayurvedic astrology is full of so many wonderful natural foods that we can eat that balance the body. See, they get into something called Vata, Pitta, Kapha. See, Vata and Pitta and Kapha are the humors, or you could say the heat and the cold and the kind of neutrality of the body. So they're kind of like earth, air, fire, and water. So you'll find all of the ancient medical astrology uses terminology like this, where it looks at heating and cooling and digestive and energetic blending of how our food is digested. And it's profound. I have to say, it's really quite profound how accurate it is. My mother got me started in this in the mid to late 70s. It was about the late 70s when we really started poking around at the medical astrology, and it was profound, absolutely amazing. And I became quite enamored with it because I noticed when I had challenging cycles, I certainly admired the astrology to the T. Back in 2010, I had Saturn conjunct my sun. And all of us are going to get that at least 2 to 3 times in a lifetime, because it takes Saturn about 29 years to go around the chart. So it'll happen to all of us at different times. But what's interesting is my heart was stopping. My son at the time was probably about 10 years old, 8 or 10. And we were out riding bicycles, and I said, feel my pulse, Aiden. That was my son. And my heart was stopping. And So out of prudency, I knew what it was. I knew it was the Saturn conjuncting the sun. And I go into the doctor and I figure, well, what the heck, I'll get a checkup. I got insurance. So the doctor says, my God, he says, you're as healthy as a horse. He said, get out of here. He said, I said, well, then why is my heart stopping? He goes, that's a good question. I really don't know. And I told him, I said, well, Saturn is over my son. And he just looked at me and says, what does that mean? So a lot of doctors are going to look at you like you're out of your mind if you bring up astrology. But I will tell you this, it is amazing, the correlations. There are many aspects that happen in your birth chart that are once in a lifetime. Like, for instance, Neptune aspects. Neptune takes 180 years to go around the solar system. That's why the United States is having a Neptune opposition Neptune, confusion and delusion. And of course, we feel like it's the twilight zone. And when you have Neptune crossing your ascendant or your descendant or your IC, which is where the sun is at midnight, the home and the family, or the midheaven career, you're going to feel these energies. And if you're aware of them, you're going to approach it much, much more, I think, intelligently. And also, you can it's like driving a car. If you see something coming at you, you change, you brake, you turn, you stop. So this is the same thing. And if we treat astrology's energetics like that, it can have a profound effect on you. And I know I've really been able to guide a lot of clients over the years, and it's given me great pleasure to do that. Like I would tell them to go see the doctor, or see a nutritionalist, or get into your diet or whatever, or reflexology, so on and so forth. I've just seen so many wonderful things over the years. I had one friend of mine, he had tumors on his legs that were literally the size of grapefruits. And the doctor wanted to cut them off. And, I can't give medical advice, and I don't give medical advice. And he asked me, and I said, I think it's parasites based on the chart. He got on wormwood, walnut hull tincture, and also cloves, fresh ground cloves. In 3 weeks, they were 100% gone. And I told him, keep seeing the doctor. The doctor doesn't have, no one has a right to tell us what and what not to do with our bodies. So what I love about this is, use the tools that are out there. And doctors have wonderful tools in terms of science and blood tests and MRIs and all these things. And they're using deductive reasoning too to figure out, hey, what's wrong? And astrology is another wonderful tool. I actually had an encyclopedia that my mother gave me from the 40s, where a whole collection of doctors were coming up with all these terms and trying to introduce it into the AMA. Well, that's not ever going to happen from what I've seen. Just like Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist who broke from Freud, was trying to get astrology into psychology. And again, psychology and astrology really fit well together because there's so many wonderful ways of looking at what we go through, the various cycles in our charts. And when you're aware of these, you tend to operate with a lot more conscious awareness. And that's the key to this whole thing. So anyways, this is very, very brief, and I would love to get into the mechanics and details of all this. But I can just tell you, it's an amazing science, and it truly is a science that has been around for thousands of years. And some of the most prolific yogis and rabbis and Arabian people, on and on through every culture have used this, and all the way up to the medieval culture and still today. So I actually have worked also with a lot of people picking times to have elective surgery done. Obviously, if you get hurt, you got to have surgery, right? But if you're doing elective surgery, I can't tell you how many years I've been picking auspicious times for people to go get something done, whether it's cosmetic or some other thing that they've been putting off that's more elective. And invariably, I have found that the time you go into surgery really has a huge effect on the outcome. I've talked to many doctors. In fact, one just recently, a very good surgeon. And he said, Jeff, he says, you're right. He says, we follow procedure to the T, to the absolute T. And he says, nothing is not proceduralized. And he said, there are certain days, no matter what we do, things just don't go right. And they just go awry. And I got to look at some of that with certain doctors, and, it was pretty amazing. If you go into surgery with the moon in hard aspects, and there's different body parts that rule various planets and also the signs. And there's a lot of mechanics in the astrology and science to this, where you literally have to, if you can, pick when the body part ruled by the planet and the sign matches the astrology in the sky, if you can get it. Now, the problem I've run into with doctors and medical practitioners is that they only do it on certain days. So you don't have a lot of flexibility. So what I always have people do is get an array of these things. Like, okay, if the doctor does the cataract surgery only every Wednesday, or you're getting some type of a cosmetic thing done, and they only do it on certain days of the week, I always say, well, then get a bunch of them, and I'll pick the best one that matches your chart and what we call the mundane influences of the astrology at that time. And it's really amazing. I've had one person, I've had several, who got frustrated and said, I can't deal with this. And I've said, okay, because I'm not here to give any medical advice. And they went ahead on really bad times. And they had a really bad time of it. Things wouldn't heal right. Sometimes they had bad infections, and it never was quite right. Oftentimes they had to go back in and get the procedure redone. So, it's never fun to have medical procedures done if you don't have to have them. And I always say prevention and avoidance is the best thing you can do if you can. But when you got to do something, it has a huge effect when you do it at a good astrological time. Again, I'm not here promoting anything. I'm just saying, if you treat it as the science that it is, the science of astronomy on life on Earth, it's really quite profound. It really is. So I've had a lot of enjoyment doing this for myself and others that ask for it. One of the last stories I'll tell was, and this is a profound one, conception elections. Some people have a hard time conceiving, and some people won't conceive. And that's often shown in the birth chart. And, there's a lot of circumstances around conceiving children. And one of the things that was really a pleasing story to me, there was a woman in her 50s, and she really wanted to have a baby. And she was in her late 40s, early 50s. I think she was around 51. That's right. And she contacted me and said, hey, can we do an inception election? And she was working with her doctor. So I actually got to work with the doctor on this. It was really fun. And they took the husband's sperm and inseminated her at a good astrological time that corresponded with her ovulation cycle. And she conceived, she carried the child to term inside of her, had the baby, no Down syndrome. I think the child now has got to be in his late teens, maybe even early 20s by now. It was a long time ago. And it was profound. Really, really enjoyed that. And I've had a lot of people who've had success conceiving with their partner at a good astrological time. And I'll tell you, the last story is my son was actually born at a good astrological time. My wife, Camille, had to induce because he was pretty big. He was almost 9 pounds and she's only like 5'1". And what was interesting about that is she said, God, can you pick a good day for me to go in and have the baby? And I said, sure. And I did. And it was perfect because she had to go C-section. And by the time the baby came out, I said, if we have him within this window, he's going to be born with the moon conjunct an exalted Venus, which is a wonderful aspect, as well as other things. You can only get what you get, but that was a good aspect. And he had a number of good aspects. And again, I always tell the story. Well, they say spirit becomes manifest when we exit the womb and first breath occurs. And I have to tell you, I literally saw 2 lights come in right when he cried, and I did not expect that. It just raised the hair on my arms when that happened. It was profound. One of the most profound things. It was the most profound thing in my life, clearly. I'll never forget it. And no one's going to tell me that we're not spiritual beings having a physical experience, because they say the spirit, psyche, and soul's attached to the embryo conception. But when we exit the womb, that is when the spirit, psyche, and soul is permanently tied in, when the spirit is attached to the body. So Very profound, profound stuff. And again, this is all connected with using astrology for the benefit of examining your energy. And again, medical astrology is an exceedingly amazing topic. I remember my son would get fevers of like 104, and it's very common with young children. Their immune systems are building. And we'd freak out, oh my God, he's at 104 temperature, right? And we're measuring and I'd look at, there's charts. You can actually look at the moon. When you ask a question, which is called interrogation of medical astrology, and you cast the chart, you can literally see when is the next shift coming. And it's by following this table of the moons. It's geometric aspects. And if you see the moon is doing something good when it hits that geometric point in the chart, you know things are going to get better. If you see it getting hard aspects, it's likely to go a little rougher. And this is what many of the ancient astrologers would use. And they would actually administer herbs that were of different planets to heat and to cool. And this is how it's done in Ayurvedic astrology. It's profound, profound stuff. And but by the way, when my son would have the 104 fever, I'd say, yeah, you'll be better right about here at about maybe 5 o'clock. And sure enough, run around, jumping all over the place, temperature's right back down. So amazing stuff. And it's a lot of fun. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week. And Ella will be back.